on the easternmost fringe of Sussex, where the chalk downs slope gently toward. The sea and fog clings to the hedgerows. Long after sunrise stands the manor of Blackthorn Grange, a house whose reputation grew not from grandeur, but from absence. Built in the early years of Queen Victoria's reign by a retired East India Company merchant, Silas Umberlyn, it was, by all outward measures, a model of provincial respectability. Red brick aged to a warm ochre, wrought iron gates bearing a modest crest, gravel drives raked with monastic precision, and tall sash windows that caught the afternoon light like unblinking eyes. Yet even in its prime, Blackthorn Grange carried a hush about it, a stillness that unsettled the postman, the vicar, and the occasional tradesman who ventured up the long lane. It was not the silence of neglect, but of containment as, though something within the walls had been carefully muffled, not forgotten. Silas Umberlyn himself was a man of routine, as rigid as the clockwork he kept wound in every room. He rose at 5:30, took breakfast alone in the east parlour, walked the perimeter of his grounds at precisely 10, and retired before 9, save for the rare evening when he invited a neighbour for port. Those who knew him described him as courteous but remote, his manners polished to a sheen that seemed less an expression of civility than a barrier. His wife had died in childbirth 2 decades prior. He had no children, no known relatives, and no visitors save for the staff who maintained the house. And of the staff therein lay the quiet anomaly that would, in time, draw the curious and the fearful alike. For over a period of 12 years, from 1863 to 1875, Umberlyn employed no fewer than 23 domestic servants. Footmen, maids, cooks, stable hands, even a governess for a child who never appeared, yet none remained longer than 18 months. None left forwarding addresses. None were ever seen again beyond the gate. The local registry recorded their arrivals with the usual indifference parish certificates, letters of recommendation from prior employers, the stamp of the workhouse clerk when needed. But departures went unmarked. No notices in the Sussex Gazette, no farewells at the village, and not even the rustle of gossip that normally trails a servant discharged for misconduct. The village elders would later recall that new staff arrived with bright eyes and starched collars, full of the kind of hope that clings to those escaping poverty. Within months, their letters home dwindled to fragments, then ceased. One housemaid, Eliza Croft, wrote to her sister in Lewes that the master walks the gallery at night, counting not steps, but shadows. Another, Thomas Griggs, a footman from Brighton, was said to have muttered on his last morning in the village, "He never counts us when we're present only. When we're gone." The words were dismissed as the ramblings of a boy homesick and overworked, but the pattern accumulated as dust does in still rooms. Unseen at first, then undeniable. Blackthorn Grange itself offered no clues. The house was immaculate, linens aired weekly, silver polished to a liquid gleam, hearth swept clean of ash before dawn. Neighbors who glimpsed the interior through open windows described it as too perfect, as though every object had been placed, not for use, but for surveillance. A chair pulled just so at the dining table, though no guest sat. A music box left open on the pianoforte, its cylinders still faintly humming after no hand had touched it in days. And always, the clock sticking in unison from hall to landing, their chimes calibrated to the second, as if time itself were being monitored for deviations. It was said that Umberlyn kept a ledger in his study bound in black calf, but no one ever saw its contents. The housekeeper of 1868, Mrs. Hargrove, lasted 14 months, the longest tenure on record, before vanishing overnight. Her belongings remained untouched, a half-knitted scarf draped over the back of a chair, a cup of cold tea on the windowsill, a Bible open to Psalm 139, verse 11. "If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me." By 1,800 characters, the village had begun to speak in lowered tones. Not of Crimer was no evidence of valensput, of omission, of erasure. Children were warned not to linger near the Grange's boundary wall after dusk, though no ghost had been seen, no scream heard. What unsettled them was the absence of sound. No laughter from the kitchen, no clatter of pans at dawn, no carriage wheels crunching gravel as staff came or went. Only the wind through the yew hedges and the rhythmic, metronomic pulse of those clocks, keeping time for a household that seemed to exist just outside of it. Yet Umberlyn himself gave no cause for official suspicion. He paid his taxes promptly, attended church on Easter and Christmas, and once donated a stained glass window to the parish in memory of his late wife. Magistrates questioned him twice once after the disappearance of the scullery maid Agnes Pike in 1871. Again, when young James Whitby, a stable boy of 16, failed to return to his parents in Hastings Bot Ek Time Umberlyn, produced signed notices of resignation, stamped and dated, and letters later confirmed as genuine by handwriting experts, expressing the servant's desire to seek opportunities elsewhere. The authorities, pressed by more urgent matters in a county rife with cholera outbreaks and labor unrest, closed the inquiries. And so Blackthorn Grange continued a house of perfect order and perfect silence, its master walking the halls at night, not with a lantern, but with a small brass tally counter in his waistcoat pocket, its soft clicks lost beneath the ticking of the clocks. Villagers claimed that on still nights, if one stood at the foot of the drive, one could hear not voices, not footsteps, but a low, rhythmic, murmuring like numbers being counted under breath, over and over, never reaching a sum. It was not until after Umberlyn's death, in the winter of 1876, found seated upright in his study, fingers curled around the tally counter, its dial frozen at 23, that the true unease began to surface. The estate solicitor, Mr. Evardy Poole, a man of meticulous habits and Presbyterian reserve, arrived to inventory the property. He expected ledgers, deeds, perhaps a will. What he found instead were 23 rooms, each locked, each dust-free, each furnished identically with a narrow bed, a wash basin, a straight-backed chair, and a small writing desk containing a single sheet of paper. On every sheet in the same precise hand was written only a name, a date of commencement, and beneath it in fainter ink, as though added long after, a line drawn through the name, and beside it the word accounted. The discovery of those rooms identical in every particular, save for the names inscribed upon the desk, sent a tremor through the otherwise placid machinery of probate. Mr. Poole, though no stranger to eccentric wills or morbid collections, found himself compelled not by legal obligation but by a quiet, creeping dread to document each chamber with unusual care. He noted that the beds showed no signs of long occupation. The linens, though pristine, bore the crisp fold lines of recent storage. The wash basins were dry, yet bore a faint residue of lavender soap, still fragrant, as if used only hours before. Most perplexing were the mirrors. Each room contained one, fixed above the basin, but all had been turned to face the wall. When Poole cautiously righted the first, he saw only his own reflection, pale and startled, yet the glass felt unnaturally cold to the touch, and for a moment he believed, though he later dismissed it as fatigue, that his image had blinked a fraction too late. He did not turn the others. Letters began to arrive at the solicitor's office in Liz, not from claimants or heirs, but from former acquaintances of the vanished servants. A retired schoolmistress in Chichester enclosed a pencil sketch drawn by Eliza Croft during her brief visit home in 1864, a view of Blackthorn Grange from the lane, but with an extra window visible on the west wing, an addition that had never been built. A farmer near Arundel sent a bundle of Thomas Griggs's belongings, retrieved from his abandoned trunk, a journal, mostly mundane, save for the final entry, which read, "Master says we are counted only when gone, but I hear them counting me still. Benefit." The page was scored with faint vertical lines, as though tally marks had been made and then carefully erased. Then came the diary of Mrs. Hargrove, the long-serving housekeeper, found stitched into the lining of a discarded bonnet by a man neared the Downs. Its pages detailed her growing unease, how the master never called servants by name during meals, referring instead to their function. The hand, the voice, the eyes, how each new hire was assigned a room not by choice but by a silent gesture toward a specific door on the upper gallery. How, on nights when the moon was full, she would hear the soft creak of floorboards, not from the master's chamber, but from the locked rooms she had never seen opened, yet which bore no dust on their hinges. Most disturbing was her account of a ritual she witnessed by accident. Standing in the shadowed alcove off the main hall one evening, She saw Umberlyn enter the library, not to read, but to stand before a tall shelf lined, not with books, but with small, lead-lined boxers. He removed one, opened it, and placed within it a single white hair. She realized with horror, though she had shed none that day. The next morning, she searched her brush. Every strand was accounted for. Poole, ever methodical, cross-referenced these testimonies with parish records, hiring registers, and railway manifests. He confirmed that none of the 23 had purchased tickets out of Sussex, nor registered at any lodging house in London, nor appeared in census rolls beyond their last known date at Blackthorn Grange. Yet their wages had been paid in full, post-date, in envelopes left with the village postmaster, each sealed with black wax bearing the Umberlyn crest. The postmaster, an elderly man named Thorne, confessed to Poole that he had once, in a fit of curiosity, held one envelope to the light and seen not coin, but a folded slip of paper bearing a series of numbers. When he later tried to recall them, he could only remember they were even, and that they ended in 0. The house itself seemed to resist inquiry. Workmen sent to clear the estate reported tools going missing, only to reappear in rooms they had not entered. One claimed to have heard a woman humming a lullaby in the east wing, though the wing had been shuttered for years. Another swore that, while dusting the grand staircase, he saw his own shadow stretch unnaturally long down the hall, longer than the light from the window could account for, and that it did not move when he did. Poole, who prided himself on rationality, began to take notes in a separate ledger, one he kept locked in his desk at home. In it, he recorded not facts, but impressions. The way the air in the upper gallery grew colder near room 17, though no window was open. The faint smell of beeswax and camphor that lingered near the locked library door, though no such substances were listed in the household inventory. The persistent sense, when standing in the master's study, that he was being observed from the corner where the tally counter lay, its brass surface dull now, its mechanism stiff, yet still capable. On one occasion, Poole swore of emitting a single, soft click when no one was near. Then came the matter of the portraits. The Grange's drawing room contained 3 oil paintings. Umberlyn as a young man in Calcutta, his wife in bridal white, and a third a group portrait of household staff, dated 1865. But when Poole compared the faces in the painting to the names in the ledger, he found discrepancies. The footman depicted bore the features of James Whitby, who had not arrived until 1874. The maid on the far right wore the exact brooch described in Eliza Croft's last letter, yet Croft had left in 1866, years before the painting was commissioned. Most troubling was the figure in the center, a woman in a housekeeper's cap, her face partially turned away, yet unmistakably Mrs. Hargrove, but Hargrove had not begun her service until 1867. The artist, 1 a.m., Fothergill, of Brighton, had died in 1866. Poole wrote to the Royal Academy, to the Brighton Historical Society, even to the East India Company archives, seeking explanation. All responses were polite, baffled, and ultimately useless. The painting remained, a silent contradiction hanging in golden light, its subjects smiling with the placid certainty of the already departed. It was then that Poole first entertained a notion he would later call chronological dissonance, the idea that time within Blackthorn Grange did not flow as it did elsewhere, but pooled, eddied, repeated. He began to measure the house not in feet or rooms, but in absences, the space between a name and its erasure, the silence between one tick of the clock and the next. And in that silence, he started to hear something else, not sound, precisely, but the anticipation of it. A breath held too long. A footstep paused mid-stride, the waiting that comes not before an event, but after a disappearance. He would stand in the gallery at dusk, the 23 doors stretching away in either direction, and feel the weight of their vacancies, not as emptiness, but as presence crowded, watchful, expectant. Once, returning to his ledger late at night, he found a single line added in a hand not his own. He counted us when we were gone. But who counts him now? The ink was fresh. The window was locked. The pattern, once perceived, became inescapable not as a sequence of events, but as a texture woven into the very fabric of the house. Poole ceased viewing the disappearances as isolated incidents and began instead to trace their geometry, how each servant's tenure corresponded not 2 months, but 2 phases of the moon, how the dates of their final letters aligned with specific constellations visible through the Grange's observatory doma, feature Umberlyn had installed, though he was no astronomer. Even the layout of the house betrayed a hidden symmetry. The 23 rooms formed a broken circle around the central stairwell, each door precisely 15.6 degrees apart, as though mapped onto an incomplete zodiac. The lead-lined boxers in the library, when finally opened under Poole's supervision, contained no relics of the Vanished O'Hare, no trinkets but only thin sheets of hammered silver, each etched with a single numeral and a date. The numerals matched the tally counter's final count. The dates coincided with no known feast, birth, or death, but with solar eclipses, all visible from Sussex, all occurring within the years of Umberlyn's residence. Local testimony, once dismissed as superstition, now assumed a chilling coherence. The blacksmith's wife recalled how, on the morning after Agnes Pike vanished in 1871, the Grange's bell rope hung taut and motionless despite a stiff east wind, as if someone had pulled it and never let go. The postmaster's son, then a boy of 10, swore he'd seen Umberlyn walking the perimeter at midnight with a lantern unlit, his shadow stretching not behind him, but ahead, toward the gatehouse, though drawn by something waiting beyond. Most compelling was the account of Dr. Armitage, the village physician, who had attended Umberlyn during a brief illness in 1873. In his case, notes preserved in the county medical archives, he recorded the master's sleepless muttering, "They are not gone. They are accounted. To be counted is to be kept." When Armitage pressed him, Umberlyn fixed him with eyes clear as winter glass and said, "You think disappearance is loss, but what if it is placement? What if they are not missing, but positioned?" The doctor wrote that he left the room with a chill that no fire could dispel, and that 4 weeks afterward he dreamt of rooms without doors, filled only with the sound of breathing in unison. Poole, now spending more nights at the Grange than in his own home, began to experience disturbances of perception that defied rational interpretation. He would enter a room certain he had left the door ajar, only to find it closed and locked from the inside. Mirrors, though all turned to the wall, sometimes bore faint fingerprints on their reverse sides, the ridges aligned not with any human hand he knew, but with a pattern he could not place. Once, while cataloguing the kitchen pantry, he heard the unmistakable clink of china from the dining room, 2 teacups meeting on a saucer butt when he entered. The table was bare, the air still, the silver tea service locked in its cabinet, yet the scent of bergamot lingered for hours. His investigation led him to the Sussex Diocesan Archives, where he uncovered a forgotten detail. Before purchasing Blackthorn Grange, Umberlyn had inherited a modest estate in Dorset, which he sold abruptly after his wife's death. The solicitor who handled that transaction, now retired to Bath, recalled Umberlyn mentioning a duty of retention, a phrase he assumed referred to estate law, but Poole, cross-referencing with maritime records, discovered that Umberlyn's wife had not died in childbirth at all. She had vanished during a sea voyage to Calcutta in 1854. Her body never recovered. The childbirth story was a fiction Umberlyn had propagated himself, perhaps to spare scandal, perhaps for reasons deeper still. In the ship's log, her name was listed among the passengers. In the survivors' accounts, she was never mentioned again. This revelation cast a new light on Umberlyn's obsession with accounting. Was it not grief masquerading as a man who could not bury his wife sought instead to catalogue presents so meticulously that absence might be rendered impossible. Yet the scale of his project, the 23 rooms, the clocks synchronized to the second, the silver plates aligned with eclipses suggested something more systematic than sorrow. Poole began to suspect ritual, not madness. He pored over esoteric texts in the British Museum's restricted collection, tracing references to numerical containment in medieval monastic practices, to soul-holding in certain strands of Hermetic thought. One treatise, attributed to a 17th-century alchemist named Vale, described a method whereby the departed could be anchored in the ledger of the living, through precise enumeration at moments of celestial alignment preventing their passage into oblivion, but also binding them to the count, not the self. Back at the Grange, Poole tested the theory. On the eve of the next minor eclipse visible, as a faint dimming of the moon over Sussex placed a blank silver plate in the library, numbered at 24, and sat in the master's chair. Midnight passed. The house held its breath. At 12:17 a.m., as the moon's edge darkened, he heard it, a whisper of fabric, soft as dust settling. From the gallery above, then another, not footsteps, but the sound of many people adjusting their postures simultaneously, as though rising in unison. He did not go to look. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his marrow, that if he opened any of those doors now, he would not find emptiness. He would find them waiting, not as ghosts, not as corpses, but as accounted things precisely and perfectly retained, forever present in the silence between ticks. He left the plate on the shelf. It remained blank, but the next morning, the tally counterlocked in his desk overnight had advanced by 1. It was at this juncture that the narrative, long confined to solicitors, ledgers, and parish whispers, drew the attention of a figure whose name would become inextricably entwined with the legend of Blackthorn Grange, Miss Eleanor Vane, a correspondent for the Illustrated London Quarterly, and a woman whose reputation for intellectual rigor was matched only by her fascination with anomalies of the human psyche. Having read a brief, anonymized reference to the Grange's peculiar staffing arrangements in a footnote of a county history, she wrote to Poole, under the guise of researching domestic economy in rural estates. His reply yet betraying a weariness that bordered on invitations, convinced her to travel to Sussex in the autumn of 1878, ostensibly to interview surviving villagers about household management, but in truth to see the house that devoured its inhabitants and gave back only silence. Miss Vane was educated at Girton, fluent in German and French, and well-read in the emerging fields of psychical research and criminal anthropology. She approached the Grange not with a lantern and crucifix, but with a notebook bound in Morocco leather and a mind disciplined against leaps of fancy. She spent her first week in the village lodging, speaking with the postmaster, the blacksmith, the curate, now elderly, their memories softened by time, yet consistent in their unease. She noted how none would meet her eyes when recalling the vanished, as though to name them aloud might summon not their spirits, but their absence anew. She transcribed their accounts with care, but it was her private journal later, discovered among her effects after her own mysterious withdrawal from public life, that revealed the depth of her preoccupation. "There is no malice here," she wrote one evening, "only a terrible precision, as if the house is not haunted, but curated." Her entry to Blackthorn Grange was granted by Poole, who, despite his misgivings, believed her clarity might dispel the fog gathering in his own mind. She walked its halls with the quiet intensity of a botanist examining a rare and possibly toxic bloom. She measured the acoustics of the gallery, noting how sound did not echo but was absorbed, a quality normally reserved for chambers lined with felt or velvet, yet the Grange's walls were plaster and oak. She examined the clocks, all synchronized not to Greenwich Mean Time, but to a private chronometer in Umberlyn's study, set 5 minutes ahead. An interval, she later learned, was the exact duration between the last recorded sighting of a servant and their official disappearance from household rolls. Most tellingly, she requested access to the locked rooms. Poole refused at first, but relented when she produced a letter of recommendation from Sir William Crookes, attesting to her work in documenting perceptual anomalies, without recourse to superstition. She entered room 9, the one assigned to James Whitby, and remained inside for 43 minutes. Upon emerging, she was pale but composed. Her notes described the room as impossibly clean, yet saturated with the sensation of recent occupation. She recorded the temperature differential 3 degrees cooler than the corridor. the faint scent of pipe tobacco, though Whitby was known to abstain, and, most significantly, the position of the chair, drawn slightly away from the desk, as if its occupant had just risen. That night, in her journal, she wrote, "I felt watched, not from the corners, but from the objects themselves, the basin, the bedpost, the ink, as though the room had learned to see." Her investigation deepened when she uncovered, in the Lewes workhouse archives, a document Poole had missed. A handwritten agreement between Umberlyn and each new servant, signed upon hiring. The clause in question was innocuous in phrasing, yet profound in implication. In consideration of fair wage and lodging, the undersigned consents to be counted in the household ledger for the term of service, and thereafter, as may be required for the maintenance of order. No magistrate had questioned it. Such clauses were common in estate contracts, but Miss Bonnet, passing the syntax with legal precision, noted the ambiguity of thereafter. She interviewed a retired clerk who had witnessed several signings. He recalled that Umberlyn always insisted the servant dip their own pen in the ink, never using the master's. "He said," the clerk reported, "your mark must be your own, or it will not hold." She cross-referenced the contract dates with the eclipse-aligned silver plates and discovered a correlation so exact it defied coincidence. Each servant had signed their agreement within 3 days of a lunar or solar eclipse. Umberlyn had not merely employed them, he had initiated them at moments when, according to certain ancient cosmologies, the veil between states of being was thinnest. Miss Vane, though skeptical of occult systems, could not ignore the pattern. She began to entertain the possibility that Umberlyn's ledger was not a metaphor, but a literal instrument of contentment, a bureaucratic ritual disguised as estate management. Her obsession grew. She took rooms in the village inn, but spent her nights at the Grange, sleeping on a cot in the library, the silver plates arranged on the table before her, like cards in a game whose rules she had yet to decipher. She documented auditory phenomena, the soft click of the tally counter at 3:33 a.m., the hum of the music box when no one had wound it, the distant murmur that sounded less like speech than like numbers being recited in reverse. She once awoke to find all 23 doors ajar, by exactly 2 inches, a uniformity impossible without deliberate design. When she closed them, they reopened by dawn. Poole, watching her descent with growing alarm, urged restraint. "You are not merely observing," he warned. "You are participating." But Miss Bonnet, once so rational, now spoke of resonance and temporal echoes. She believed the vanished were not gone, but suspended, held in the interstices of the house's accounting. Neither alive nor dead, but indexed. Her final journal entry, dated October 12, 1878, read, "I understand now. He did not hide them. He preserved them. In counting, he kept them from dissolution. And if I am counted too, then will I be accounted? Or will I become the counter?" 3 days later, she vanished. Her notebook was found open on the library table. The last page bore only a single line, written in a hand trembling yet precise. "Room 24 is ready." Miss Vane's disappearance was not met with the clamor one might expect. No constable rode hard from Lewes. No broadsheets carried her likeness beneath headlines of foul play. The Quarterly, discreet by nature, merely noted her temporary withdrawal due to ill health. Poole, now the sole custodian of the Grange's secrets, buried her journal in a lead-lined chest beneath his floorboards and refused all further inquiries. Yet privately, he knew the truth. She had not fled, nor been taken. She had been accepted. The house, having tested her intellect and found it worthy, had offered her a position not among the vanished, but within the mechanism itself. He began to notice subtle alterations in the daily rhythm of the Grange. The clocks now chimed in a sequence that mirrored the opening bars of a Chopin nocturne Miss Vane had once hummed while transcribing witness statements. The scent of bergamot returned, but layered now with the faint trace of her lavender ink. And on the morning after her vanishing, the tally counter displayed 24, though no new servant had been hired, no contract signed. It was then that Poole, against all professional instinct and personal dread, descended into the Solera space Umberlyn's inventory had listed as unused storage, yet which Poole had never entered. The iron-bound door, previously stuck fast, swung open at his touch with a sigh-like exhaled breath. Below, the air was dry and cool, smelling of stone and ozone. The walls were bare, save for a single feature. A vast wooden cabinet, floor to ceiling, its front fitted not with doors but with 24 narrow drawers, each inscribed with a name and date. The final drawer bore the name E. Vane, October 8. Poole approached, with the caution of a man walking toward his own The open drawer belonged to Silas Umberlyn himself. Inside lay not a relic, but a sheaf of papers, tied with black ribbon. The documents reveal the quiet, devastating heart of the mystery. They were not spells or incantations, but meticulous calculations, astronomical charts, actuarial tables, harmonic resonances between planetary alignments and human pulse rates. Umberlyn, it seemed, had been a student of a forgotten school of natural philosophy that held number not as symbol, but as substance. To count a thing was to give it form. To recount it, to sustain Italiano. His wife's loss at sea had not been a tragedy to mourn, but a flaw in the universe's acundia soul uncounted, and therefore his life's work became an attempt to correct that error, not by retrieving her, but by building a system so precise, so harmoniously ordered, that absence itself could be rendered impossible. Each servant was not merely employed, they were integrated into a living ledger, their presence stabilized through ritual enumeration at moments when time thinned. They did not die. They were preserved in the syntax of the house, their identities folded into the architecture of accountability. The final page bore Umberlyn's own hand, written the day before his death. I have counted them all. Now I must be counted too. To remain the counter is to remain outside the sum, but to enter the ledger is to be held. Let the house count me last, and keep me with them. Poole understood then that Umberlyn had not been the master, but the final entry. The true master was the system itself, the silent arithmetic of the clocks, the geometry of the rooms, the resonance of names inscribed and struck through, and Miss Bennet, in her quest to comprehend it, had become not its chronicler, but its latest functionary. The witness, who, by seeing too clearly, became part of the witnessed. He returned to the upper floors with a new, terrible. He no longer tried to leave. Instead, he took to walking the gallery at night, pausing before each door, listening not for sound, but for the quality of silence behind it, that dense, attentive hush that spoke of presence held in a bind. He began to note changes in the house's behavior, books reordering themselves on shelves into sequences that mirrored eclipse cycles, the pianoforte emitting single notes at intervals, matching the servants' heartbeats as recorded in Dr. Armitage's files. And once, in the mirror of the east parlor which he had never turned to the wall, he saw not his own reflection, but a figure in a solicitor's coat standing behind him, wearier, holding a ledger open to a page that read P. Everhard Poole, 1881. The date had not yet come. He did not resist. He began preparing his own room, though it had no number on the door, arranging the bed, the basin, the chair with the same fastidious care Umberlyn must have once shown. He wrote no journal, left no letters. But on the eve of the winter solstice of 1881, the village postmaster received a package wrapped in brown paper and sealed with black wax. Inside was Poole's pocket watch, stopped at 11:55 p.m., and a single sheet of paper bearing the words, "All accounted, none missing." The Grange stood empty thereafter, yet not abandoned. Villagers reported lights in upper windows on clear nights, though no one entered. The clocks continued to chime, their mechanisms untouched by rust or dust, and on evenings, when the moon hung full over the chalk downs, those who walked the lane claimed to hear not voices, not weeping, not even footsteps, but the soft, rhythmic sound of counting, unhurried and precise, as though time itself were being tallied, one soul at a time, in a ledger that never closes.